Hi there. In this presentation I'm going to share with you a technique I call dialogical writing. There's a flip to the technique that I call dialogical reading. Now essentially what this is a way of elaborating or refining the writing process to make it basically more of a dialogical one. You can use it to look at things you've already written and attend to the dialogicality of what you've written. Why is that a good thing? Well, I'm not going to explain that right now, but there is quite a lot going on with this notion of dialogicality. Making meaning is something that we all do all the time, and you may have noticed or not that a lot of the time we make meaning, we're doing it with others in mind, whether the others are present to us or whether they're not physically present to us. There is a sense in which making meaning is a dialogical process, or it can be described very fruitfully as a dialogical process. That's very abstract and philosophical. I want to be very practical in this video and show you the technique, show you how I arrived at the technique. It comes out of my primary school teaching, oddly enough perhaps, but I really want you to have a go with it, and you can do this at many different levels, and I want you to start at the simplest level really, just to get a taste of it. And then I'm going to suggest maybe some ways in which you can use it to look at the writings you've already done, or consider it in actually coming up with new things you haven't written yet that you want to write but not quite sure how to go about it perhaps. Anyway, more on that later. Now I've put this beautiful picture of something that is sensuous, a forest, a beautiful forest covered with rocks covered in moss, and I live quite close to some forests that look very much like this, and the reason I've put a forest up there is because there's nothing more wonderful than being in a forest and in a way getting lost in the forest. And sometimes when things are going well with our writing, we are sort of lost in the beautiful forest of our thinking, of our ideas. And then when we look at our writing the next day, we think, oh, blimey, that we are lost. we were, lost in a negative way. This writing is not going into the place where I thought it was going, or I read or I share the writing with somebody else, and they're not sure that it makes the sense that we thought it made, etc., etc. So forests are beautiful places, but that doesn't mean that we don't need to have some techniques in order to make the most out of being in those places. Well, anyway, again, I'm getting too philosophical. Let's get on to something a bit more concrete. So we're orientated to writing in different ways, and I think it's quite useful to think of these three ways. The most important way perhaps is let's never forget that writing helps us understand things. We write to learn, or we can write to learn. We can see writing as a gift, even though it's a struggle. It can help us articulate things in a way that makes a difference to our understanding. It's not like we didn't have the understanding before we wrote, but the act of articulating it somehow makes it more precise perhaps, more publicly shareable, and maybe even reveals our misunderstanding or areas that are still really quite mysterious to us, and that's useful. That's a gift. Another way we get orientated to writing is to think of writing as an assessment, and let's face it, the dissertation is an assessment. It's a lot of things, but it's also an assessment, and obviously that can leave us with a bit of a bad taste in our mouth especially when we think that writing is basically the act of trying to show some other that you are good enough, that you know what you're talking about, etc. That's part of our reality, I'm afraid. But anyway, hopefully that won't dominate our orientation to writing, especially when we can think of writing, and especially the dissertation, in this third way that I've put on the screen. We can write as part of realizing our responsibility for educating our readership. Now, I know that sounds a bit maybe pompous, oh my God, I'm writing to educate my reader, give me a break. Well, in a way, you can think of your writing as doing exactly that. And I think it's really helpful to think of your dissertation as basically a tool that educates or could educate your readership. Because that concept of educate, and I mean, what does educate mean? That's an important concept for us. And I'm not going to start spouting educational philosophy now, but certainly to have an educational role, a relationship to your readership that is educational, that does mean something about how we go about composing and designing our writing. And I think this dialogical writing technique can help with thinking of that role in an educational way. But you'll just have to take my word for it at the moment. There's a big problem with writing. There's loads of problems with writing. It's definitely a struggle. But here's one problem. Producing language that will be read in a way that does justice to what we intend to mean. So now we've just written something. Isn't it obvious what it means? Well, of course it isn't, because the reader is an interpreter, and the way they interpret what we've written may not be what we intended but nevertheless, that's the way they're going to interpret it. It's very hard to know whether we have done justice to what we intend to mean. One way, of course, is to share the writing with others and to try to elicit what their real response is to that writing. Do they really get what you were saying? That's certainly one way, and I think that's a good way. But what I'm going to show you later on with this dialogical writing technique is a way of developing a kind of a consciousness of what the readership is wanting you to give them. And that sounds a bit exaggerated or ambitious, you might think, but anyway, I'm not going to explain that now, but that's one of the things I'm hoping you'll sense that this technique can provide. Which means then that when we write, it would be wise to capitalize on the dialogical nature of the composing process. The dialogical nature of the composing process. It's so easy to think that writing is about recording our ideas. You have an idea, you write it down, you have an idea, you write it down, etc., until you run out of ideas. Or you wonder, well, what ideas do I need to write down? And that creates some anxiety, not quite sure where to start, and so on. So there is value then in listening to our own writing. You write something down and you listen to what it is saying as though you were the reader of it. Well, in a sense, of course, you are the reader of it, but the reader that you intend the writing to be read by eventually. Now, why do that? Well, because that gives you a clue as to what you need to write next. Every time you make a statement, for example, in the mind of a reader or a listener, all kinds of ideas are triggered by that statement. All kinds of questions may be popping into their minds. And if you can be sensitive to that and go some way into addressing that curiosity, you're likely to keep your readership with you. And so that's partly what I mean by the dialogical nature of the writing process. But again, I'm talking rather abstractly. I'm actually going to put this into a concrete technique and have you practice it as well in a moment. So let me talk a little bit now about how I got to the technique, what got me to it, and then I'll have you have a go with it. It started with my teaching of primary school kids in the US many years ago now, when I would go around to various classrooms and help out with their language arts program. So in America at that time, at any rate, in this school district, kids went through a language arts program, and my job was to basically help the teachers with the kids' writing, writings in all different areas, not just English, the subject English, but all kinds of writings. But anyway, my job was to basically help with literacy, if you like. And I carried with me a bunch of keys because I could get into many different classrooms. So it was a huge bunch of keys, much bigger than this bunch of keys I'm putting up on the screen here. And the kids were very interested in this bunch of keys. And I knew that they were interested, so I used that in a lesson that I designed. And it was a pivotal lesson that gave me this insight about the dialogicality of the writing process. Now, one of the things I noticed in going to all these different classrooms in the school was the dominance of the teacher asking questions and the lack of opportunity, it seemed, for the kids to do the same. So typically you'd have a classroom lesson where it was the teacher who was asking a question, a student would respond, and then the teacher would evaluate that response and then maybe ask the same question in a slightly different way because it wasn't the response the teacher wanted, or maybe move on to a different question, and so on and so forth. So this structure, which in the research literature I learnt later is sometimes referred to as initiation, response, evaluation, IRE, initiation, response, evaluation, and then the cycle is repeated, is a very typical, very common dynamic in many classrooms. And if you think about it, it's probably inevitable that it will be that when you are teaching, you are trying to get the students to think about an area and in a way guiding them along a certain path in that thinking, and so the teacher is sort of in charge of the pathway in which the thinking goes. So it's kind of inevitable to some extent. But the problem with that is the prevalence of the questioner. The prevalence of the teacher being the questioner. Wouldn't it be better if there was more equity in this process and that the students also got a chance to practice being a questioner? Because questioning is a kind of an art form. It's a skill that the teacher develops because they do it so often, so they get quite good at it. Why would it not be beneficial for the students to also practice that skill? So I thought, I'm going to design a lesson which actually puts on the table this notion of getting the kids to ask questions, and tries to get them to see how wonderful it is to think about their questioning skill, and to maybe develop it and do something with it. So I went into the classroom, and because I knew they were very interested in my bunch of keys, I stuck this on a lovely piece of equipment that you never see these days, called the overhead projector. I stuck my keys on the overhead projector, so it made this beautiful silhouette, because the projector projects an image onto a big screen, and when you put an object on the screen, it comes out as this lovely silhouette. So they were all looking at this, and I said to the class, "Hey kids, here are my keys. I'd like you today to, because I know that a lot of you are always asking me questions about them. Well, go ahead, ask me questions. Anyone got a question?" And one student said, "Well, how many keys are there?" I thought, that's a great question. So on the overhead projector, instead of answering the student, I wrote their question down. How many keys are there? And somebody asked, "Well, is that a car key?" Did the same thing. I just made a list, started to make a list of all the questions that they asked. And of course, there were many questions. And of course, when one student asks a question, that gives some inspiration to another student to ask a question. It kind of triggers an idea that they might have, and so on. And so they started asking me loads of questions. And before long, I couldn't write any more of their questions on the overhead projector because I'd run out of space. And I hadn't answered one question yet. So there was this air of expectation in the room. When is Jed going to answer my question? It's up there on the screen. When is he going to answer it? So I started to answer it. I said, "Right now I'm going to answer your questions." Everyone was very attentive. "How many keys are there?" 32. Is that a car key? Yes. When did you get the big brass key? Let me think. I think I got it, and I would give the answer. Do you have a key to a safe? Oh gosh, no, I don't, I'm afraid. I don't have a safe. I don't have much money, in fact. What's the key you'd hate to lose the most? Oh, that's a really interesting question. Ooh. And it went on like that. What's that funny shaped key for? What's the littlest key for? The littlest key. So I looked at to find the littlest key. Well, that's interesting, because that little key there, gosh, I didn't even know I had that still. Well, when I was 11, my grandmother gave me a leather briefcase as a birthday gift. It was a second-hand leather briefcase, but it was a really cool birthday present, and it had a lock on it, and it had a key, and that's the key. I've still got it. I mean, I don't know. I don't have the leather briefcase anymore. My grandmother's no longer with us. That was a long time ago. But how wonderful! I've still got the key to that leather briefcase. Wow, that was rather moving, actually. Now, isn't that interesting when we look at your questions? How some of them were quite productive in terms of the response I needed to give to them. So here's one thing we can learn then about our questions, is that some questions are rather easy to answer. How many keys are there? Well, I'll just count them, give you the answer, one word. But other questions, not so much a one-word answer. So different questions have different productive potentials. I'm pretty sure I didn't use that phrase, productive potentials, with the primary school children, but somehow or another I managed to explain this concept, because I wanted them to think about the quality of questions and the quality of questioning. So that was step one. And then step two in this lesson that I designed, I put on the screen a chart, and it was basically like this. It had a statement it had the word statement on the left, the word prompt on the right, a line in between. And I said to the students, I want you to all think about a few things that are true about yourself, anything you like. So I gave them a minute to think of something that was true about them, and we shared them and so on. And it wasn't too difficult for them all to come up with one true statement about themselves. I've got a sister. I like ice cream. All kinds of things came up. Rather interesting things came up as well. So that was quite amusing. So anyway, they were all able to do it. And I said, right, I'm going to show you something now. I'm going to come up with a true thing about myself. What shall I come up with? What's a true thing about me? Oh, I know. I'm going to say I like to read. I do, actually. It's one of my biggest hobbies is to read. I like to read. Now, if you were to imagine that statement was like the bunch of keys, and you wanted to find out about that statement, just like you wanted to find out about my bunch of keys, well, what would you do? And of course, it's an obvious question in a way. One of the students says, well, we'd ask you, Jed, just like we asked you about the keys. Absolutely, you'd ask me. So go ahead, go and ask me then about that statement. And so they asked me, and they would say things like, well, why do you like to read? Or what do you like to read? Or do you like to read all the time? Or when did you start liking to read? Lots of questions. Brilliant. Now I'm going to choose one of those. I'll choose this one, and I wrote, well, why do you? And then I'm going to try and answer it. Actually, it's harder than I thought it was going to be. Well, I like to read because it transports me. Now I've written a second statement. And so I said to the students, well, if you wanted to know about that statement, what question could you ask of that statement? And again, they came up with lots of possibilities. And I said, right, I'm going to choose one of them. What do you mean by that? It's a good question. Yeah, what do I mean by saying it transports me? That is a good question. It's a hard question. Well, I think I'll answer it by saying it takes me to other worlds. A third statement now. And again, the process is repeated. And I chose one. Well, what kind of worlds? Well, if it was science fiction, it would be worlds of the future. Somebody said, well, what are they like? Well, these can be very exciting and weird. That's what I answered. Well, in what way weird? Well, they're like and unlike our own world. Could you give an example? Yeah, and I gave an example probably from some science fiction book I'd read recently, and on it went. And so you can see what we've got here is a chain. I call it a dialogical chain. I like to read. Why do you? Because it transports me. What do you mean by that? And so on. So if you were to take all of the statements in the left-hand column and just pay attention to those, you would have a paragraph that read like this. I like to read because it transports me and takes me to other worlds. For example, if it was science fiction, it might be worlds of the future, and these can be very exciting and weird. Future worlds are like and unlike our own world. For example, in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, and I would go on, as to what that was like. And so one of the things that struck me about this was how the statement column was quite coherent. That each moment in it, each sentence tended to fit quite well with the preceding one. That there was a good what you might call thematic control. Without talking about thematic control, you could just sense that there was a kind of an organic feeling about a text like that. Not surprisingly, that was the case, because it emerged out of this dialogical process. So that was one thing. But the students also, when I got the students to then try this out with their own statements about themselves and started to create their own chains, they started to notice things like this, that there were some generic prompts that you could always rely on. What do you mean by that is an obvious one. Demonstrate that, illustrate that. How did that happen or occur? Give an example, give some examples. But that also, in addition to the generic prompts, there were these prompts that were not generic at all, that were very specific to what had just been said. And so there were generic prompts and there were non-generic prompts. Now, for many of the kids in that room, this was kind of a revelation in their writing. It was like I'd given them some sort of tool that enabled them to be so much more productive about writing. It gave them a technique to increase their productivity. If you think of writing productivity merely in terms of length, right? Which is not everything, of course. But if you're a reluctant writer or you're nervous about writing, it's actually a big deal to be able to fill a page or more and to go on and on. So there were lots of benefits for these primary aged kids in this techniques, in using this technique. And then a little bit of reflection. This is more me thinking about it over time, about the quality of the questioning, what it actually does. So one of the things questioning can do is it can move us to deeper understandings if we follow through with the questions. Now I want to stop here. There are other things to notice about questioning, but I want you first to have a go. So press the pause button, take a sheet of paper. On the sheet of paper, draw a line down the centre, write statement on the left, prompt on the right. Start your statement column with, well, anything you like really, but it needs to be a statement. It could be a true statement about yourself, doing exactly what I asked the students to do, the primary school students to do, or it could be something else, something related to maybe your work with your research project. It doesn't matter, but I do want it to be. I do want to give you an experience of success with this. So don't make it too difficult. Come up with some statement that you feel like you know quite a bit about already. Just as a beginning, and then come back and see the rest of this video, because I'm going to show you how this is actually this might be applicable to doctoral level dissertation writing, even though I'm starting with primary school writing. Okay, see you in a bit. Okay, well, welcome back. And there were three things to notice about questioning that I could see as a result of doing this, and I wonder if any of these resonate with your experience. So I put the first one on the screen already. Questioning can move us to deeper understanding if we follow through with the questions. So I wonder if any of you felt that some of the questions that the prompt column came up with were actually simple prompts, but actually quite hard to answer. And then there were others that were just really easy to answer. Another thing to notice, questions have differing productive potentials in the context of composing. Did you notice that? Were there some prompts that actually gave you, more than one sentence perhaps? And then others that not so much. The content of the questioning determines the path of the thinking. So this is a very more subtle thing to notice about questioning, that you are in a way doing this technique, you are actually in a sense two agents. You're the agent that produces the prompts, that produces the statements, and you're the agent that produces the prompts. But of course it's you're really all of those. You're playing two characters in a way, and so you have some control now over the path of the thinking, because you're also the prompter, and so you can decide how difficult those prompts are going to be, for example. That's very true. Now, all right, I'll stop there, because there's something else I want to say about that, but I'll leave it. Now, I want to show you then, before I move on to what this has got to do with dissertation writing, I want to show you dialogical reading. So here is a text that was copied out of a social studies textbook. By 1929, American factories were turning out nearly half of the world's industrial goods. The rising productivity led to enormous profits. However, this new wealth was not evenly distributed. Very factual. The students were older students than the ones I was teaching with this dialogical writing, but they were having to read stuff like this and probably doing something with it, hopefully part of a research project that they were doing, and they would write it up or whatever, but it's very hard to process all of that unless you are really sort of engaged with the text, that you really want to know about this, and you can find some way of being present with all the information. Otherwise, it's just information. So, tell me then about the American economy at this time. Well, by 1929, American factories were turning out nearly half of the world's industrial goods. So what? Yeah, so what's the implication of that? Well, this rising productivity led to enormous profits. Well, that's good. Well, no, actually, this new wealth was not evenly distributed. So that was a negative part. So you can see, I hope, that just these three little prompts here turn it into a dialogue. The same text turned into a dialogue. And once it's turned into a dialogue, we're able to attend more to what the import is of what's being said, and the relationship to what's being said to what has already been said. So it has that going for it. So this is why I call this dialogical reading. Let's do one more example. This is from a biology textbook. The cells that line the nasal cavities have cilia, tiny hair-like extensions that can move around like whips. The whip-like motion of the cilia sweeps the mucus into the throat where you swallow it. So we've been learning about nasal cavities. What is striking about the structure of the nasal cavity? When you look at this picture, let's say, of a nasal cavity. Well, the cells that line the nasal cavities have cilia. Oh yes, they do. And what are these like? How would you describe them? Well, they're tiny, they're like hair-like extensions, and they can move around like whips. Move around like whips, that's interesting. What's the purpose of all this then? It's a very, biological question to ask. Well, their whip-like motion sweeps the mucus into the throat. And then what? Or so what? Well, you swallow it. So again, I hope you can see that just those four prompts turn a monological sequence of information into a much more dynamic encounter with some ideas that are not just a linear sequence of information. That there is a relationship between each moment in the text. So putting the dialogicality back into the monological text actually brings the text to life in a way that it might not have otherwise. All right, so I'm going to show you one more example that is this time with graduate students. So many years ago, I used to teach philosophy of education to undergraduate students in America, in the US. And one of the things I liked to do was show the movie The Dead Poets Society. A little bit cheesy, this movie, but it's an oldie but goldie. But if you've ever seen it, one of the things about it is the drama that is created through, in a way, teaching philosophies, competing teaching philosophies. That's sort of at the heart of the drama of the whole piece. You've got this progressive, romantic teacher whose name is Keatings. Of course, there's a reference to Keats there, played by Robin Williams, the late Robin Williams. And his teaching philosophy is really at odds with the traditional, stuffy, privileged, private school environment in which he's working. So there's this wonderful tension that's based on a philosophy, and I thought, well, that's really useful. Since I'm teaching philosophy of education, we'll watch this film, and then we will try to use philosophical theories of education to make sense of this tension. So that was one of the motives for me using the film. Now, and there's a little picture of Keatings being the true romantic English teacher that he was, helping this particular student. A very moving scene, I think, where he helps this student create almost a poem on the spot. And this student has great anxiety, has sort of what we would say nowadays as mental health issues, but he empowers this student to deliver this wonderful poem, and the class are in absolute awe as a result of this. So it was a momentous part of the film, showing this romantic expressivist philosophy at its best. Anyway, one of the things I asked the undergraduate students to do was to write about the film and to try and bring out its philosophical theory. So the following is an original paragraph written by a student trying to explain the link between a Rousseauian, romantic-inspired philosophy of education and the ideology informing the character Keatings in the Dead Poets Society movie. And this is what the student wrote. So their first part of it anyway. Mr. Keatings was an example of romanticism in the movie. Romanticism can be explained by Rousseau's theory that most education practice he saw around him was disastrous. Rousseau believes that the focus should be on the nature of developing and concentrating less on what should be learned. Mr. Keatings, who tries to get the boys in his class to learn in a more natural and fun way, shows this quite frequently. Okay, so imagine a reader who's never heard of Rousseau, knows little about the film. I think it would be very hard to follow what was written here. So imagine now someone listening to the student reading this and statement by statement asking questions which the student then answers. So I'm going to show you now is the new text that was generated from such an encounter, because I actually did meet with the student and went through a dialogical writing, reading process with them. And this is the first part of what we came up with. So everything in blue is new, everything in black is the original text that the student wrote, and we didn't eliminate anything of what they wrote, but we elaborated quite a bit on what was there. So that's the blue text. So the student starts off, Mr. Keatings was an example of romanticism in the movie. What do you mean? Well, he embodied a way of thinking about teaching that was based on a philosophical theory about education. And what is this theory? Well, Romanticism can be explained by Rousseau's theory that most education practice he saw around him was disastrous. I'm still not getting what you mean by what this theory is. I don't quite get it yet. Well, because for Rousseau it implied that children were fundamentally wicked or savage-like and therefore needed strict disciplining. That's why it was disastrous. Why was it a disaster? Well, this was a disaster because it meant that children weren't really being respected as children. Now I'm getting it. Okay, so what did he do? Well, Rousseau developed a philosophy of education that was based on the very different idea that children were actually quite precious and innocent. This led him to the idea that the focus should be on the nature of developing and concentrating less on what should be learned. And more on what? And more on how you learn. Okay, and how should you learn? Well, for Rousseau, learning should be a matter of natural discovery. And what has this got to do with Keating's then? Well, similarly, Mr. Keating's tried to get the boys in his class to learn in a more natural and fun way. And what kind of things do they learn? Well, Mr. Keating's focuses more on what he thinks the boys should learn that should better themselves and the kind of man they will naturally grow into. And how was this received by the school? Well, not surprisingly, he gives assignments that the school did not understand because they were different from the traditional methods that were not based on a romantic philosophy. So hopefully you get the idea here. And what I'll put up on the screen here is the full paragraph now. So everything in blue is, as I said, is added, and the black is the original piece. And if you read that carefully, I hope you agree that it's coherent, it flows well, not surprisingly, because it's the result more of a dialogical process, and it respects what the reader needs to know about. So there is a sense in which the writing, the production of the writing has responded to the needs of the reader. Okay, so I think that dialogical writing then can be used not simply to compose something from scratch. It can be used that way. That's how I used it with the primary school students. But it can be used later on when you've written something already and you look at it and you ask yourself what are the prompts that have given rise to each moment in this, let's say, paragraph. And you may find that there are prompts that are missing, that need to be addressed, that prompts arise rather that haven't been attended to in the body of that first draft. And that's very useful then, because then you can do what I did with this student, is you can start to elaborate in a way that is quite productive. So what I'd like us to do in preparation for the study day is to have a look at some of our text and look at how the prompts, which are of course not there, they're invisible. You have to imagine what they are, figure out what they are, but look at them and see how well or not so well they attend to the quality of text flow. Is it doing what you want it to do? Does the text flow? Does it have that coherent, organic feel to it? So that's one thing to look for. Attend to the organisation of the themes. Is there a clear structure? When you look at just the prompt column, so to speak, is there a structure to that? What about the range of themes? Is there missing text? In other words, in the Dead Poets Society text, there certainly were quite a few missing prompts. So the range of themes was a problem there. And then you could also look at this really more subtle area in a way. What's the agenda underlying the prompts? And this is a crafty question, because of course you come up with the prompts. You're anticipating what the prompts are, or you're trying to abduct what the prompts might be. But is there an agenda there? And actually having a sense of the agenda of the prompter is quite an important thing to be able to develop, because especially when writing is used for assessment, you can, it's quite helpful to know what the agenda is of that particular kind of reader. When they read a dissertation, when your examiners read your dissertation, they're wanting to get some assurance that you are caring to be the researcher that you are saying you are. So how do you signal that you are that caring researcher? Well, you signal it in many different ways, in the way that you've designed your research project, in the way that you attend to that design, etc., etc. We can talk in more detail about what that might be, but an understanding that then is understanding the agenda of the reader, and that can make a difference then to the prompts that you can see are being attended to or not being attended to. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. But anyway, for the study day, if you can bring with you some text that you have already written, or a sketch of a text that you haven't yet written but would like to write, that would be great, because what we will do is discuss in a bit more detail this approach to dialogically composing writing, but also give you, most importantly, an opportunity to use the time as productively as you can, and share that with others as well. So a number of things there. All right, that's it. Thank you for listening, and I hope that was clear, and I hope and I look forward to seeing you very soon. Take care. Bye bye.